Welcome to the Energy Summit. This next session is an interview with Jeff Whitney to discuss many of the security challenges that have been in front of the midstream operators over the last few years and how that applies to operators around the world and in all parts of the oil and gas industry. Enjoy. Jeff Whitney is joining us here, and I've chosen to do things a little bit differently in connecting you with Jeff. Jeff has had kind of a unique perspective on some of the really important things that have been happening in the midstream world recently. So I asked him to join us, and we're going to just have a conversation for the next half hour or so. Jeff is the president of Berkana Resources. And I always get it wrong where it is home is for Jeff. Is it Dallas, Jeff?
No, we're out of Denver.
Oh, okay. What I want to talk about today, Jeff, is relatively new, and maybe it's content that you've been working with midstream customers on for a while now, but it's become really pertinent in the last few years. How has security changed for midstream operators in the last couple of years? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for pipeline operators or midstream operators in general, the approach that the regulatory environment took was kind of hands off. So the operators took the approach that they needed to be secure, and they tried really hard to ensure that that all of their OT infrastructure was secured. And they looked at things like recommended practices or standards, and there were a whole bunch of them out there. There's ISA 99, API 1164, the ISO IEC 62443. There's the TSA guidelines. There's the NIST 882 series. There's the framework that came out, but they were kind of looking at those, and some of the clients would pick like 1164, others would go to ISA 99, and it kind of came down to what committee you were on. So if you had one of your employees on the ISA committee, they would probably adopt the ISA 99 standard, or you would go with the API 1164. So what happened was, unfortunately, after Colonial, we all kind of knew this was coming, but it started going regulatory. So TSA put out a guideline in 2018, and it was yet again another recommended practice or standard you could look at. And then after Colonial happened with a phishing attack, which a lot's been written about, TSA decided to come out with a security directive. The first one was in May of last year, and they're 1 year time frame security directives. So you have about a year to comply. And basically the main thrust around that was to establish a baseline of where you are. And there was a lot of information in there about how they wanted you to report it. So TSA and the CISA, it's basically, they teamed up, and then they decided that you needed to report any cyber incident to that organization. So that's really what went on there. And so that directive came out, and then shortly after in July, SD2 came out, and that's a lot more prescriptive. So that security directive really kind of kicked the industry in the butt. Once again, it's a 1 year security directive, but there are deadlines in both of these directives for you to comply. So now compliance became a big issue. And a lot of our operators, people we work with in the industry, kind of had to stop. It's another unfunded mandate, like we had, Sarbanes-Oxley for the IT side. So the expense is on them, and they must comply. And here's the deadlines. What was interesting about it was they actually addressed both IT and OT. So both sides were now regulated by TSA. So that's kind of what's really changed in the industry, and it's had a massive impact. We're doing an awful lot of work right now with compliance with these operators around ensuring that they comply with the deadlines.
So you've been going in and kind of doing some assessing with customers and trying to identify how what they're already doing complies or where there's gaps. Isn't it true though that most pipeline companies actually have a fairly fairly structured security framework already. I mean, you brought up Colonial Pipeline. Colonial Pipeline has a pretty strong security practice already, even before any of this happened. Was that a bit of a shock to the system, or did people kind of see this coming? And how does this now change what was already a relatively strong practice?
Well, I think that's a good question, but I think when you look at the overall security posture, the overall corporate risk profile for these companies, they are addressing risk. There's no question. They've spent a lot of time and treasure, as they say, addressing these risks. And the bottom line is, I think everybody kind of adopted the Purdue model for segmentation and all that. And a lot of these standards are recommended practices reference to Purdue model. So they had some level of network segmentation, DMZs, those types of things. And the manufacturers were also with recommended, practices, and also, reference architecture like you referenced earlier. And you guys helped write some of those reference architectures. Cisco did a wonderful job in the OT space around pipeline operators. So they have a lot of things to look to determine whether or not they're in compliance with industry best practices. So the approach was really one of industry best practices. And a lot of the tier one operators, the really large guys, they have their own policies and procedures. So what we saw was the smaller mid-sized operators, US based, were looking more at the domestic, recommended practices, the ISA 99s, maybe the API 1164, that kind of stuff. And we saw the larger operators adopting the international standards like the 62443. So what happened there is ISA 99 was a recommended practice standard, as it were, for security. And they teamed up with ISO IEC and came out with 62443. And the intent from ISA's perspective was to come out with an international standard. So that's basically what they did.
Wow.
So, and there was a lot of time and energy put into that. And our CTO at the time was on the committee, and it really got down to a language issue role. And it was what is. I mean, they would agonize over a paragraph for, multiple meetings. So it was really well thought through.
Well, speaking of language, I mean, you've been spouting some pretty confusing numbers for a lot of people. There's obviously people on the call now, that I recognize on the list there that probably understood all of the standards that you referenced, but I know there's some that are kind of glazing over a little bit with all these standards. What is the bottom line here? If I'm a partner, a Cisco partner that doesn't really understand the nuances of all of these standards, or a Cisco seller, or maybe I'm a frontline worker at an oil and gas company, maybe midstream even, and I don't necessarily know all of these standards. What's the bottom line for all of this in terms of how pipeline operators are changing the way they're doing things? Like, what are we trying to address here?
Oh, sure. And so in the old days, and I remember this because I'm an old guy, basically we had separation that was air gapped. I mean, a lot of times the OT stuff, well, you throw data over the fence. And as we integrated more with IT and we saw the confluence of OT and IT, you started having a bunch of security issues that you didn't really have to deal with before. So now there's that question of where does IT end and OT begin, and who has the authority to determine what happens in each of those networks, because they are separate with most of the clients that we work with. So there's some kind of firewall or some kind of protection between them. But the real issue is really making sure your process control network or OT network or whatever you call it, ICS network, is secure, and that it is secure from outside attack. And it's the defense in depth kind of methodology. The closer you get to the asset, the higher the levels of security. So you really want to secure those assets. And if you have operators operating in a control room, you have to make sure that that control room environment is secure, and that the data transmission, out to the assets where you're actually controlling devices, valves, pumps, whatever, is secure. Because that's the overall goal, is to ensure that nobody can hack into that network and change something that would have a negative impact on people or the environment. Because that's two things you worry about, right? impact to the environment or
Well,
impact to people.
yeah, and what I find interesting is even in the Colonial example that you referenced earlier, a lot of people associate this whole security operation or security process as being really a network architecture thing or a data architecture thing, where you have tools to lock down all of these information flows, right? But what we saw in the Colonial example is that the OT side wasn't actually directly compromised by any of these flows, right? It was actually a
Correct.
different mechanism that shut down the OT environment. Can you describe that a little bit? Because this is bigger than just the technology. There's people and process involved as well, right?
That is exactly right. It's people, process, technology for a reason. Technology is on the bottom. You have to manage the people first from a security perspective. So it comes down to awareness. And you have to make sure everybody's aware of what the risks are to your organization. So, and then you get your processes in place to ensure that people don't, violate procedures, and that they follow processes to ensure that the security is actually there from the people perspective and also from the technology perspective, because you have processes around technology, of course. On the technology layer, what's interesting about that is we've seen companies have phishing attacks. And the first thing they do is they go out and put more bumps in the wire. So they're having an issue at the people layer, and they're solving it by going to the technology layer and saying, hey, if I could put more bumps in the wire, I'm good, or I can segment the network better, add a DMZ or whatever I'm going to do there. Add more firewalls, whatever. It's all about equipment, which is good. But at the same time, you want that segmentation. You've got to address the phishing problem, and that is a people problem. So you really have an issue with people opening emails, doing things ransomware, like with Colonial, where you end up in a situation where, especially if they phish and get your credentials, I mean, what good does it do to have all these bumps in the wire if I've got the credentials to get through them all? In the case of Colonial, they literally came into the IT network, and Colonial made the decision to shut down the OT side of the house because they didn't want it breached. So that was a decision that they made, and probably the right decision. But everybody, I think, has an opinion about that. But I think it was probably the right decision, but had a huge impact on the Eastern U.S., as you know. And as a result of that, of course, unfortunately, a lot of times, the regulatory guys are event driven. And so something happens and then they come into play. But, having said that, in fairness to the regulatory bodies, we all kind of knew this was coming because, as you know, on the electric side, it is regulated. It's the NERC SIP security requirements, and there's some pretty hefty fines if you don't meet those security requirements. There's been a lot of discussion in Congress, some bills that have been up there on the Hill to ensure that the pipeline operators, also have security level standards that are being met. And so there's a lot of pressure to get that market regulated. But it hasn't been, and again, until we hit the TSA directives, and those are regulatory.
So we've talked TSA, you just referenced the Hill, which is very much a U.S. reference. How does this apply to people outside of the U.S.?
Oh, sure. So the U.S. a lot of times I think helps drive some of the security standards and also operational standards. People like PHMSA, the Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Administration, come out with operational requirements, and a lot of the other countries adopt those. We've seen the same thing with security, where, again, back to the ISA 99 and ISO IEC, that is an international standard. So what we're seeing now is more cooperation between countries and a number of areas, the European NIS, things like that, where we have cooperative bodies trying to come up with standards that can be implemented internationally. So because security doesn't, respect any borders, somebody's going to try to hack you. They're going to try to hack you regardless of
you just went
where you are.
There we go.
Yeah.
We lost you there for a second, but you're back.
Oh, sorry.
Hey, I want to go back into the alphabet soup for a little bit.
Sure.
You've sometimes used the word the acronym VADR or VADR.
Sure.
This is pretty relevant to this conversation. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and how it's important?
Sure. So in the TSA Security Directive 2, I think it's section 2D, they set a requirement for OT to go do what they call a validated architectural design review. That's what a VADR is. And there's a deadline to have that achieved. So right now we're working with a number of operators in the midstream market to achieve that deadline. And it follows a fairly specific process, the NIST process. So, I mean, there are templates for kind of how to do this, but the VADR process is really about documenting where you are. What is your architectural design for OT? And then how have I documented that? And is my documentation current? And the big challenge is that, as you know, whether it's IT or OT, changes are being made to infrastructure all the time. And the documentation kind of follows. And what we've seen out there, which was really interesting, is that with the advent of COVID, with people not being in the shop, a whole lot of that documentation is 2 years old or older because they haven't had people in the shop to really focus on that. And so things were kind of frozen a little bit. But having said that, there have been changes that haven't been documented. So that's one of the challenges we're seeing with operators right now is getting the documentation current, because that's the first requirement is you have to have things documented from where your architecture is now. And most of our clients are Cisco based, so they have a lot of Cisco equipment, and that equipment has to be managed as well. So that's the second piece is asset management. You know, what do I actually have out there? And you have to document that. So that's a big challenge as well, because a lot of times, you know, guys have IP lists or whatever, but they don't really know a lot of times because sometimes those IP lists don't get recorded correctly, or IPs are given out that nobody documented. That's another big problem. And then you have this equipment out there that you don't really kind of know what it is, or it's not documented. So you can't produce a document that shows what assets you're managing. Because the problem with security, right? It's if I can't, you know, really understand what assets I'm securing, how can I ever say that I'm secure? So you have to identify the assets you're managing. That's kind of the first step is what am I managing from a security risk profile perspective?
Yeah, a couple of questions kind of come out of that for me. You referenced the NERC SIP and NIST frameworks earlier. Do you think that we're going to actually get into a rhythm here where once this initial kind of compliance exercise gets done, that we're going to end up with like very regular review cycles that are going to need to take place, or is this kind of a one-time check?
Oh no, it's not a one-time check. Some of the requirements are to do things annually. I mean, you really need to do like an architectural review annually. So yeah, it's going to be ongoing. They've kind of kicked over the fire ant mound here, and everybody's scrambling to figure out how am I going to comply within the first compliance window, and then after that. So you know, they're setting it up for operators to meet certain levels of requirements. You know, down the road. It's not just a one-shot deal, and that's the problem you have a lot of times with these security projects. You go in and you take a snapshot of what the environment looks like, and 3 days later something could change, but you think you're at security risk profile X and you're actually at Y because something happened. We had one client where somebody took a hub in and stuck it in their office in the OT network, and we saw all this crazy traffic and we couldn't figure it out. Well, you know, it's crazy stuff happens. It's just crazy what happens on the OT side.
And it seemed like a really good idea at the time, I'm sure, for whoever did it, but didn't realize the implications, right? I mean,
he wanted more ports to plug stuff in his office.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly. It seems simple.
He didn't have enough ports in the wall sockets, so he just threw a hub in there. We've had some crazy stuff happen, but no, I think it's a worldwide, global issue. I think this woke up a lot of people. Operators worldwide woke up and said, "Gee, what's the U.S. doing?" And they're looking at what TSA is doing as well. You know, Transportation Security Administration, they literally are stepping up here. And again, back in 2018, they put out another standard, and it was pretty good. The other thing too is the physical security aspects of it, because that's a big issue.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody talks about cyber, but I was presenting at Intellect 3 years in a row, and I kept pounding on the desk. If I can physically access your network, I own you. And so that started creeping into some of the standards as well. Not so much because of me. I just think that, people started waking up going, hey, we need to address physical security as well. So that's a component of this as well.
So a couple
For me,
of questions. You talked about it going from the U.S. and the TSA directives out into the world, and I think there's it's maybe somebody from Asia Pac actually reminded me the other day. It's probably not the U.S. influencing the rest of the world, but maybe everyone's moving in parallel, which is probably they're all kind of looking at each other, right, to some degree. But what I would also ask is do you think that this midstream regulation component is going to shift into downstream and upstream as well?
Yeah, it's for operators. They don't really care what assets you're operating. So from a midstream perspective, yeah. But I mean, if you're upstream, you've got a different set of risks, right? I mean, you're not so much going to impact the environment or people if you've got a bunch of wells, right? So you do things upstream that, although you can impact the environment or people, of course, if you're on the production upstream side. But we've seen things like cloud-based SCADA for upstream. So, actually the cloud becomes an aspect of that. And that's another issue for midstream, upstream, downstream, is where can you connect the cloud and what about edge? Because in the current standards, I just came off the 1164 committee, and that was updated and released, and I think in August last year. But the issue with that I raised, that I was concerned about, was more around the cloud and edge, because even though you can kind of say, well, that's a zone, I didn't perceive that we actually managed, in the standards, in the security requirements, we didn't really touch on phishing enough. We didn't touch on cloud or didn't touch on edge. Because if you look at the Purdue model, the problem you have is at layer 1 and 2, you can't really connect the cloud there. And TSA directive SD2 kind of cemented that, saying, okay, you can't bring in the cloud. You can't connect an untrusted network to a trusted network. And in the OT environment, whether it's upstream, midstream, downstream, you don't want to connect the cloud at that layer. And that's another issue. Now, there's ways you can get around that. You can connect at layer 3.5, and then you can transport down to that layer. Or what we're seeing as well with edge is some of the companies are putting in things like data diodes, the old Sandia data diode, where you have, unidirectional data transmission. So, and there's 3 or 4 companies doing that, Waterfall, Owl, and Fox, and they have the data diode solutions that you can put in. So if you need something pushed to the cloud, you could put in at layer 2 a data diode and push it up to the cloud. Yeah. The problem is you can't send anything back and issue a control command or do something, that could impact your operations. So we're seeing that as well.
That's actually really, really important to highlight is this notion, because quite frankly, over the last couple of years, since this has become a real focus, I've seen most of the heads down activity in the pipeline operator space, right? I have not seen the same level of urgency in refineries or in production facilities. And so this is a really interesting commentary to me, that like most of what these directives say applies in these other segments as well. And it'd be a really good kind of reference system for them to adopt as well in preparation for maybe regulation coming up, right?
Yeah, and I think if you're moving hydrocarbons, you're going to be regulated, right? At some point, whether it's from a security perspective, operational perspective. One of the examples is that PHMSA, and when they came out with the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, when they came out with the original regulatory requirements, they excluded gathering. Well, guess what just got included? Gathering. So,
Okay.
you're seeing that. Yeah, so the new mega rule came out and they started addressing gathering. So we know that eventually the same thing's gonna happen. You know, it doesn't really matter where you attack it. If you're on the production side, you know, and you attack it, well, that's gonna impact obviously the whole industry. But it's a little more difficult if you got a bunch of wells and you're running you know, LTE out to them, or whatever you're doing to collect that data. There's not as much control, and you're really not getting into the bigger issues until you start transporting that crude or that refined product. So that's where a lot of the concern is when I'm transporting it logistically. So you get into logistics, it's a whole nother issue. But again, if somebody sets down a well, well, you have one well down, but you need to know that. So there's a lot of new technology around production. And of course, downstream, that's a big issue as well, especially in the refineries. But those are more kind of, you know, they look more like a plant, like a chemical plant or refinery or whatever. And so you can kind of run a wire to it. You know what I mean? So it's kind of contained geographically, whereas pipelines run thousands of miles. And you have a whole different set of security concerns. And they also, pipelines run through HCA areas, high consequence areas. So you have to mitigate any risk associated with that product flowing through that area. And again, that's a security concern, operational concern, security concern, safety concerns. Sure. There's all kinds of issues.
So I want to, this has been awesome. Thanks so much, Jeff, for just shedding light, because a lot of people don't have access to these directives directly. They really went very specifically to customers. And so there's a lot of this, even general information, that's not well understood out there. So thank you very much for shedding some light on some of that. I guess what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is talk a little bit about what you do, right? Because you've been good enough to come on. I'd like to hear a bit about how do you help customers with these directives, but also I know you've got some products and services out there that Berkana has put out to the energy industry and is making a material difference in business, you know, in business outcomes. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yes, sir. So at Berkana, we are moving forward with edge solutions for operators in the midstream market, and we're seeing that basically the edge solutions are solving very specific problems for clients. So rather than have us build or design kind of a ubiquitous solution for the industry, we started an edge a couple of years ago, and basically I didn't want to go into edge until I had a few things solved in my own mind about how we were going to basically implement edge. And one of the big ones was security. The other ones were kind of solved, or a lot of them were solved when we became a design-in partner with Cisco, because now we have the ability to take existing infrastructure, upgrade it, and have that Docker-enabled equipment where we can download solutions at the edge into equipment that the clients were going to buy anyway. They're going to upgrade their routers at the edge, right? So now they're Docker-enabled, which is brilliant. So we started leveraging that as a company and building solutions into Cisco product so that we can provide edge solutions. One of the ones we're working on now is really more around a protocol issue, where you're basically having to deal with an old protocol. And I really enjoyed the conversation about serial, because there's a lot of legacy serial stuff out there. And then a lot of my clients, the 485 and it's great. But a lot of our clients are on satellite as well, like the Hughes stuff, and they're going through a big upgrade this year. And they kind of went from, you know, serial and IP over SAT, the old 7700 stuff. So there's a lot of change in that market to where everything's IP all the way out to the asset. Well, if you're IP all the way to the asset, you've got a lot of issues out there. And by the asset, I mean out to the PLCs, you know, layer 2, layer 1. There's another issue with that, because now we're seeing smart instrumentation, smart valves, smart things that could also be, you know, a data capture problem as well. So you have to build edge solutions that can incorporate not only legacy, but the new stuff coming online. All these, you know, born digital products. So we're trying to deal with that with clients, and they're throwing us some pretty interesting problems to solve. And that's kind of what we're doing through our design-in partnership with Cisco, which really gives us a huge advantage.
I have so much fun talking to different partners who are finding ways to use that Cisco capability to solve, real business problems. And I know you're working with a lot of the big oil and gas companies in your region, and making a difference. And we're going to actually hear from another design-in partner after the break here, who's doing a similar kind of thing for a different business outcome. So this is really cool stuff, and it was really interesting to hear Pete talk about that Dockerization, and being able to put microservices into the Cisco routers per se, right out into middle of nowhere, right? So some really good power there. Not a lot of compute, but you can do some really powerful things with that little bit of compute that's out there. And we've got some really good, solid deployment systems around that and partners that are really leveraging that. So thanks for sharing some of that, Jeff. And thanks for taking us through that security bit as well. Any last minute kind of things, and then we'll take a little bit of a break here, and we'll come back with our other guest.
Well, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to present/interview. And I apologize for all the acronym soup and all the numbers. We've been working with this for quite a while. One interesting comment you made was about access to the TSA directives. There was actually a FOIA request because they only sent it to operators. And you can now get it. You can download it. It's redacted, but not very heavily. Yeah, you can actually get a copy of it. Yeah, it's just lightly redacted.
If anybody's interested in that, reach out to me. I'll track that down, and we'll get that link out to anybody who's interested that doesn't have access to it. That's good to know. I wasn't aware of that. Thanks, Jeff.
Sure, no problem. Thank you again.
Thank you for joining us for this session. If you found value in this session, please like and subscribe, and click on the next video. Take care.